Okay. So is it our sixth week? I think it's our sixth episode of Like Clockwork. It might be our fifth, which is, they're starting to blur together. But welcome to another week of Like Clockwork, a podcast of Chicago filmmakers. And today was a pretty big day for Chicago filmmakers as we had the governor, the lieutenant governor, the alderman, and a number of other people, the cast of Chicago Fire, and the producer of Chicago Fire, all visiting Chicago filmmakers in order to bolster the Illinois Workforce Development Initiative, which we are part of here at Chicago Filmmakers, in which we offer classes, free classes, mentorship for production assistant training in order to bolster the local film economy that's Chicago and Illinois. It's a really huge initiative. It's a big boost of what we've done as an organization, and look out for the next wave as we begin to continue to develop the local film economy. In addition to that, of course, in just 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks, we have the Onion City Experimental Film Festival, which is fast approaching, and it's extraordinarily scary for me as the marketing manager, as there is so much to do. But please check out chicagofilmmakers.org and onion.cityfilmfest.org for information on the full program and how to get your tickets. That all being said, it is an honor to be able to present this roundtable this week with some awesome people. We have Michael, Michelle, and Will. And of course, Michael Glover Smith is representing Chicago. And it's, again, a real opportunity to bring these folks into conversation, especially because with some of these folks, I've had a lot of conversation about cinema, about the modes of distribution, about just film theory or philosophy in general. And so I would like to pass over to each one of our guests to give a brief introduction before we get into the bulk of our program. So Michael, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Michael Glover Smith. I'm an independent filmmaker here in Chicago. I also teach film studies at 3 colleges in the suburbs, and I also occasionally write criticism for Cinephile Chicago. And I'm a big fan of Chicago filmmakers. Each of my last 3 features has screened at Chicago filmmakers. And I'm a fan of this podcast, so thank you for having me.
It's a privilege to have you on as well. And Michelle?
Hi. So I'm really terrible at these introductions, and that kind of segues into the way I see filmmaking and conversations we'll be having on this podcast. So currently, I am a media strategist and writer at a design research lab here in New York, where I'm based. I also have never been to Chicago, so this virtual thing with the Chicago community feels really exciting, I guess. It's like, that's just full disclosure. Never been to Chicago, always wanted to go. So it's an allure and very much in my imagination right now. So design recently, which I still am doing, scholarship in architectural history. And then formerly in my past, where I met Woody, I call him, but Michael, it was, I have a filmmaking background, and in between lots of artistic endeavors and projects and gestures and things. Writing is being the basis of a lot of the way that I weave through a lot of the stuff that I might touch on. So, and thank you for having me as the surprise guest.
Long overdue. Long overdue. And Michelle and I go back to 2007. So one of my besties in the world, and someone with whom I've had hours and hours and hours of like clockwork conversations. And Will.
Cool. I'm Will Erokan. I live in Los Angeles, California. I curated a cable access show called Here Comes Everybody that I'll be talking about later. What else? I edit animated movies, which I'm doing right now, and then I also do experimental video stuff to boot. Yeah, I've never been to Chicago either, except for the Greyhound station. I went through Chicago once.
So, welcome everybody to this week's discussion. I am going to be passing this off now to Michael Glover Smith, who will present a topic that in some way makes him tick.
Well, the topic that I chose to present is self-distribution for the independent filmmaker, which I thought would be a good topic to discuss simply because I've made 4 feature films since 2015, as well as a short that is going to be premiering next month. So that's a pretty prolific pace at which to make films. And my most recent featured relative is still in theaters. I'm still promoting it. And we actually are screening tomorrow night in Lake Forest, Illinois, as well as in Toronto, Canada, which is our international premiere. So I wanted to talk about this because I feel like a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are probably independent filmmakers. And it's something that I get asked about a lot after screenings. Whenever my film screens, I usually am either approached in the lobby or someone will email me the next day and say, would you like to get coffee? I really want to pick your brain about how you're able to make movies and how you're able to get them seen. And so this is a kind of topic that I'm used to discussing with a lot of people one-on-one. But I also think it's important because in the independent filmmaking world, these things are tricky. I think a lot of people discover how to get their film seen through a process of trial and error. Because I went to Columbia College as an undergrad right here in Chicago, and I went to Humboldt State University to get my master's degree. And I never learned how to raise money. I never learned, how to put together a pitch deck to try and attract investors, and then I also never learned, how to submit movies to festivals. I never learned anything about, how to try and attract distributors or how to self-distribute. So what you basically learn in film school is the nuts and bolts of how to make a movie, the fundamentals of writing and directing, the fundamentals of cinematography and editing. And in a way, I mean, that's kind of the easiest part of the whole filmmaking process is the process of the physical process of making the film is really easy, especially now in the digital age. What's really difficult is getting the work seen once you're done, because I do think that digital filmmaking tools have, kind of democratized the process. So everybody is making movies. You can make a movie on your phone, but that's just more people that you have to compete with. And one thing that I've seen a lot of filmmakers do that really fills me with sadness personally is to dump their movies into the streaming graveyard prematurely. I think a lot of filmmakers feel like, especially when they make micro budget features, which are the kind of films that I make, they kind of feel like, they hope to get into the best festivals. And then the dream is that some distributor is going to approach you at a festival and buy the theatrical, distribution rights for your film. And that's kind of the best case scenario. And of course, that rarely happens. And so when most filmmakers are done with their festival runs, they end up thinking, oh, well, we didn't get distribution, therefore we're going to just put it online because, we want as many eyeballs as possible on the movie, and that's the easiest way to get it done. But I think that self-distribution is what everybody should be doing. First of all, I'm 47 years old, so I grew up watching movies in the theater, and that still to me is kind of a sacred experience. But I also think it's really a shame for filmmakers to be putting their films online right away, simply because the theatrical market is there. And, you're not exploiting it by putting your films online. My most recent film, Relative, as I said, we premiered a little over a year ago. We premiered in March of 2022 at the Gasparilla International Film Festival in Tampa, Florida. We played a couple more film festivals in the spring. And then in June, we had our world theatrical premiere at the Music Box Theater, as well as the Gene Siskel Film Center. We played both of those venues the same week. And so we considered that to be kind of the joint theatrical premiere. And since that time, we have had 75 theatrical screenings in 16 different states in the United States as of today. And then, like I said, our Canadian premiere is tomorrow. And so our film has, done well commercially. We've made over, I can say this because it is a matter of public record. If you go on Box Office Mojo and you look up the film Relative, you'll see that we've grossed over $24,000 at the US box office. And we've done this without an advertising budget, which I'm proud of. We've done this by basically cold emailing movie theaters and giving a pitch to the programmers, asking them if they'd be interested in showing our film. And the pitch basically contains the poster, the trailer, critical blurbs, information about what awards we've won. And a lot of the, programmers have gotten back to us and said, yes, we're interested in showing it. Most of the time, they don't give us a full week run. It's usually just, what they call a special screening, or perhaps, 2 or 3 special screenings in a weekend. But we've managed to do well in spite of not, being able to hire a publicist and to pay for ads. And a big part of why we've been able to do well is I've traveled to a lot of theaters myself. That is one area where I've spent my own money, is I've paid for my own travel. But whenever movie theaters have been able to advertise that they're having a Q&A with the director, we always do good business. There are a lot of independent theaters in this country that are run by people who care about cinema, who think it's cool to bring directors into the theater to have a Q&A. And then the people who attend these theaters, and I think Chicago Filmmakers is a good example, the people who go to these theaters as spectators, they're cinephiles, and they're adventurous in their viewing habits. And they also are loyal to the theater because they trust the programming. So, I feel like a lot of filmmakers are just missing out by putting their films online, because once you make your film available to stream, then you're really never going to be able to show it again in theaters, simply because people will have the option to stream it. So we're going to keep Relative in theaters for another few months. I've done this before. In 2017, I made a film called Mercury in Retrograde, starring the great French actress Roxanne Mesquita. And that film did not do what I wanted it to do festival wise. And so I self distributed that one theatrically, and we kept it in theaters for like 2 years. And that was ended up being the right thing to do, because eventually that film did find its audience, but it took a little bit of time. Because we did screen in New York and we did screen in LA with that movie, but not until 2019. We screened, Will, you might be interested since you're a Los Angelino. We screened at the Rooftop Cinema Club in Hollywood. And we were programmed, by them. We were not, I should also point out, I've never four-walled a movie. So I've never rented a theater and then sold the tickets myself. I basically, pitch the film to theaters and ask if they're interested in programming. And that's how all of my films have been seen. So if we had put Mercury in Retrograde, if we had made that available to stream online, we would have never played New York or LA, because those screenings happened over a year and a half after we had already had our theatrical premiere. So that's just what I wanted to talk about, and I hope you guys found that interesting.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, there's much to talk about actually at the end of this, because I think many of us, especially in this roundtable, have had the experience of self-distribution and of creating that network that you're talking about. And yes, Chicago Filmmakers should be seen as being one of the hubs of the networks of cinemas. Thank you, Michael. That was amazing. And I'm going to move it over to Michelle. Michelle.
Well, that was really interesting. I brought up a lot of questions in a more theoretical sense about social media, about just what distribution means, digital platforms, and the democratizing of, the fact that everyone can self-publish. So it's, it's sort of you take the view, or like the agency, the ownership of that. Or there's a lot of navigating institutional gatekeeping, which I think a lot of this podcast is allowing us to talk about. That's one thing that I find is a thread that ticks people off. I think is the recurring theme, I should say. That was really interesting. And yeah, I'm not sure, I don't have a presentation of a topic to talk about as much as just putting ideas of positions and maybe responses to that, in the sense that I think in filmmaking, I'm not sure, Will and Michael, it seems that I think Michael's a journalist and Will may be filmmaker slash something else as well. But I'm interested in that slash part where we're taking many roles and playing many roles and taking on different hats, and how that is reconciled in our own heads. How do we see them as, part of a longer thread of something, or I guess the techniques of that and how, different things will bleed into one another. I'm just interested in hearing about how everyone is navigating this kind of post film culture world, that I remember was so vibrant in the, I wouldn't even say early aughts, but like I think it sort of went haywire like 2012, or when Godard made Help Me, Woody.
Goodbye to language.
Anyways, it just seems like since the rise of, I guess, I don't want to even say, I mean, social media, I guess, is like that thing, but that's a very general way of putting it. A certain shift of, it could be. I'm not trying to diagnose like the death of film culture, let's say, but whatever this shift is, it feels like there's a bunch of like vagabonds, I would call them. Like everyone who's sort of trained in filmmaking is now trying to find like an island. Or they do the I'm a filmmaker, but then I have to find the challenge, like the challenges of like self distribution, and it just seems like there's either more opportunities to share your work than ever before, or a more complex and complicated way of navigating the gatekeeping that museum practices and theatrical spaces and programming are erecting in a way. So, yeah, those are just some general thoughts.
It's perfect, actually. This, I believe, if I know Will also well enough, has become the podcast for all of the different ways in which we must navigate both the politics as well as the logistics, as well as the art of self-distribution, curation, alternative distribution, and online distribution versus physical. And with that, I would love to pass this over to Will.
Okay, here I am. Yeah, so I first got into to cable access video when I was living in Olympia, Washington, and we were living with this guy, David Montgomery, who wanted, he was like some sort of a lawyer adjacent person, and he wanted to create like it's maybe like a sovereign citizens type TV show with like outlaw bikers and stuff. And so he sent me down to the cable access place to take the class, and I took the class. We never ended up making that show, but we started to make a different. I started to make a different show with friends of mine from school called Safe Harbor, and it was like every month we would pick a prompt, and then we'd all make a short off that prompt, and then we'd program it. So like one month it was like the color red and cutting every 2 seconds and something else, right? So then everyone would kind of make an experimental film like that. And so that was interesting. We did that for about a year. Then I moved to Oakland, did some more cable access stuff, got into like rave VJing as like a method of exhibiting video. I was also messing around with like hypnosis and subliminal messages and stuff. So I was kind of exploring that at these As You Like It parties. And yeah, those were pretty successful actually. Then all the while I was working in animation basically, and so I was able to get a lot of equipment from the studios that they were throwing out, like old VHS tapes, blank tapes, and decks and BNC cabling and like all sorts of stuff. So I started to kind of like incorporate that into my work. Like exploring, which is now like glitch video, but kind of exploring all that, like broken equipment, basically. And then eventually, I got down to LA, and I was kind of checking out the scene, and couldn't really get into it in the same way that I had been able to prior. And then I was like, oh yeah, the internet. I could make like a show kind of like Safe Harbor now. With the internet, and there's all these like vaporwave kids and like all this stuff out there. So I put it out. I put a call out, I think on like a vaporwave forum or Facebook group, and I was like, yeah, on the 22nd, send me your videos, and then I'll put them on cable access on a show called Here Comes Everybody. And I got a pretty good response. I thought I'd get like maybe 30 minutes of footage, or of videos. But I ended up getting like an hour and a half. And so I had a few episodes. And every month I'd get like a few episodes worth. There was, by the end, I think there was like 56 hours of episodes, which was quite a few. And so first, it was kind of hard. This is in like 2016. It's like, okay, cable access doesn't really exist anymore. Where do I find stations? Because this is like a whole separate issue. But the way it works in America is when the cable companies first came in, they made a deal with the public that if they had access to the land, they would create a station in every city, right? That the citizens had access to. It was a trade for like laying the cables. And then like under Bush, when AT&T got into to streaming, or not streaming, to broadcasting television, they didn't have the same stipulations because it wasn't a deal with the phone companies, and the cable companies got mad, and they decided that you didn't really have to have cable access stations anymore, so kind of gutted the whole thing. But they still sort of existed. Yeah, and sorry if I'm kind of rambling about this. But so then I was like, all right, got to find a station to put the show onto. And I contacted people in Berkeley and in Oakland and in LA and Portland, Olympia, like all over the place. And I think Portland was the first station to kind of come through. And so I started programming on there, and then eventually LA came through. And by the end, let me look. By the end, we were in LA, Pasadena, Berkeley, San Francisco, Portland, Olympia, Seattle, Waukegan in Illinois, North Liberty, Iowa, Ithaca, New York. We're on all those stations pretty regularly. And then a few other stations probably irregularly. But yeah, I guess I'm not really that great at just rambling like this.
No, this is great. Ramble on, yo.
Okay. Yeah, so like the stations, they didn't really want me to or not that they didn't want me. They don't want you to create like a nationwide distribution network on cable access. It's all supposed to be local. So you have to kind of, and one of my stipulations was I wasn't going to spend any money on this project at all. So if you pay for a membership, you can put stuff on TV, but you usually have to prove that you live there. So I was trying to find places. I just like cold email while I was at work. I'd cold email all these different companies. I'd kind of pretend that I lived in the town sometimes. Sometimes I didn't have to do that. I just kind of send them an episode. Like some of them were cooler than others. I definitely got turned down a lot. But eventually, yeah, I had this kind of like pretty good distribution network. And as that was happening, right, so that's just the distribution side. I was online. I was trying to find like new avenues to recruit artists into it. So I started with the kind of vaporwave, and then I reached out to like the film community, to people I knew through that. And then I was on like Frameworks, and I was posting on there, and I started getting college professors sending stuff and sending their students stuff, which was really cool. I got people from me. There's people submitting from all over the world. It's pretty amazing. And what else? Maybe is that enough?
Putting the spotlight on anybody to speak right about it, especially the things that you're passionate about, can sometimes seem as though, or I've found that some of my guests don't understand how profound that they are. And part of the great thing is that just means that you're also very low key people about how awesome and your contributions are to cinema. So with that being said, what I do is I listen to you, create a whole bunch of notes. Today, I've actually been typing my notes as opposed to scrawling them down. So I should have a better view of them as I go off on my ramble. My ramble ties together everything that you've said with also kind of my own personal experience, which I hadn't really been talking too much about my own experience or my own work with film until recently. A couple of our guests had provoked me to do so, and then especially last week's episode, we had folks from Film Diary, New York City, on, and Film Diary actually could easily be on this week's program too. They are a duo, Saint and Sage, who created a film festival and their own forms of distributing work that is made from the outsider, underground, avant-garde, experimental film community, but doesn't necessarily reflect a lot of the dogma and a lot of the academic and institutional control on that particular term, experimental film. And I actually find that very much relates to a lot of what Will is doing too, in the sense that Will's own public access curation also is far more freeing, far less constructed by the dogmas that have related to, say, quote, experimental film as this part of independent cinema. And that's a very important part also, I think, of how I relate to what Michael has been talking about as well, in the sense of self-distribution. So I agree. When we give online space our free access to, say, the work that we've done, essentially what we also do is we oftentimes kill its ability to then be shown in a theater. And of course, that was made worse or perpetuated by the pandemic, which, of course, closed that space. As someone reporting here from a Firehouse Cinema, which means quite a lot to me, and as Michael has stated, means a lot to the community of Chicago for independent filmmakers to be able to have a space where they can actually show their work in a proper setting with sound, with a larger screen. That makes quite a big difference sometimes to the work. And then at the same time, I make something that I call disassociative productions. Disassociative productions is a conspiracy theory, something that relates to cinema, and cinema is one of the main forms of its distribution. But I think of my work as mapping in the interdisciplinary way that Michelle is talking about to all of the contours of mediated virtualities, as well as, say, physical spaces and infrastructures. And those things have become quite interrelated, let's say, especially after the dawn of the internet, which has taken these spaces, flattened them and expanded them, created so many different forms of the compression and expansion of these spaces. And yet I also feel that the pandemic space was one of flattening, mainly of flattening, despite the fact that it was also potentially extraordinarily, say, a silver lining of it may be that it created an absurdity in a popular cinema. Now, that absurdity in popular cinema has also become hyper real, and so the question then becomes: is this such a great thing? Is this exactly the opposite of what one wants when they're trying to make some transgressive cinema or transgressive work? Because when that transgression becomes an adopted style of a mainstream cinema, to what extent now have we lost the tools of a radical cinema that, let's say, we would have had to distribute ourselves? I think there's a number of things that I've just brought up and tangents that kind of explode out like a shotgun. One is this idea of what the pandemic has brought about in terms of the change of cinema, the change of its distribution model, but also of, maybe in a positive sense, the absurdity that's arisen because of some of the infections of our society, the corrosive effects of our political state, as well as the potentially all immersive and downright bizarre ways in which we began to obsess over and use media as a salve to create our isolation little bubbles. Even calling it a bubble seems wrong. It seems more like we became a media sheet. Within spaces, we began to reduce our movement as much as possible. And even the act of going outside was a transgression, but not a transgression out of, let's say, a political or even philosophical or metaphysical ideal. It was rather a true transgression against others, so say lack of empathy potentially. I think that the way that all relates to gatekeeping is really interesting as well. What Michael is talking about is true. Once one actually begins to show physically in a theatrical setting that is grounded in community theaters, in particular, I speak of Chicago Filmmakers, where the organization that I helped co-found, Agitate, once created a screening. We literally contacted Chicago Filmmakers before I started to work here as marketing manager, and they brought our work and the playlist into their theaters as the first screening that they had post-pandemic. There are settings, there are theaters, galleries, etc. I also bring up the Vast Lab from Los Angeles, who's coming to visit soon. Los Angeles Center of Digital Art, ATA Gallery in San Francisco, Counterpath, AGX Collective in Boston, La Lumiere in Montreal, etc. It's far more common to actually find this model I've personally found within Europe, where you'll have literally, even in just the country of France, you'll have 6 or 7 different theaters where you can go to, or in Germany, where you have Hamburg, Kino Wolf Cinema, etc. These places are the hearts of a particular type of culture that still exists, that is rooted not just in cinema, but is rooted in this interdisciplinary idea, usually a politically motivated place as well, a place where dialogue occurs on a weekly, if not a daily or nightly basis into the wee hours of the morning. My own experience has been varied when it comes to the distribution of feature films. My first feature film, I managed to have the right, say, formula for it to be presented in Paris by Collective Jeune Cinema, and Collective Jeune Cinema contacted me, paid me money to go and tour that through a number of different theaters in Europe. However, my latest feature film, Commodity Trading, I have had to painstakingly go through, and even when the festival circuit seemed to ignore that movie, finding people who liked the work or who supported my body of work to give it a chance. Even having somebody watch a movie nowadays is difficult, especially at a feature length. That brings me to the sort of online, the last bit that I'll wrap this part of my response up with. This online machine and what it does to cinema. And the difference between the online machine and the television is actually quite interesting. Although the television is a cool medium, it does not reflect the type of flattening that I think occurs with online. In fact, there's something still really transgressive about a transmission. And so this transmission through a televised method and then using public infrastructure to do so creates its own form or its own medium. However, Vimeo, YouTube, etc., and I'm guilty of paying God knows how much money for Vimeo now, it also inherently compresses your media. And the compression that's applied to, especially to experimental film, where you might have, let's say, a change in every single frame, that can destroy or have an extraordinarily corrosive effect on the significance of the frames or the significance of what is inside of the film itself. It can change the meaning of it significantly, or it can actually erode the significance that one puts within each frame, especially if they think and take care to present to you an image experience or an image sound experience that needs to be read with extreme specificity, which I think a lot of the great filmmakers are doing. And so, as a result, what is also done is it's created this, say, TikTok cinema, which I'm not against in let's say, um, in its form or anything like that, but it is a different form of composition. Let's say the spectacle of it needs to be more legible. The space in which it exists is smaller, so the action that occurs within it oftentimes needs to be, say, taken to a hyperbolic state. And that does scare me a bit. It scares me to think that there's a lack of subtlety, but that I don't know. I'm not talking about the sort of subtleties of, like, say, a highfalutin art kind of stereotype. Rather, that there is a visual analysis that is lost along the way. And it seems that the only thing that has since replaced it is a more intense troll visual analysis. And all of those things to me speak of a place that we find ourselves as filmmakers that's raw, is really fraught. Now, I will say one last thing that's great, though, is that out of circumstances in which there are less resources available everywhere, those who must make art with a lot of resources, and there's a lot of people who have never figured out how to make art with less resources. So those who must make art with a lot of resources tend to stumble. And as a result, there is a sort of democratization of the work that becomes seen or gets finished in those times, let's say. And speaking of this pandemic as one, but there is a positive, say, space in which this sort of language can continue to develop by those who had already been developing their work without the help of a resource-driven model.
Well, I'd just like to jump in, Michael, and say I absolutely marveled at what you just said, because it's so impressive to me that you're able to listen to three people present topics without knowing what they are in advance and then tie it all together. That was absolutely amazing. But I was also kind of saddened by your use of the word flatten, which really describes, I think, a kind of depressing phenomenon about the act of watching films online. Because at first I thought you were using the word flatten in a cultural sense. I thought you were saying, oh, when movies are online, they're all kind of the same in terms of how they're perceived. But then the more you talked about it, I realized you were also talking about the aesthetics of movies. And I think that's really interesting. I think the word flatten applies in both cases. And when you were talking about TikTok, I couldn't help but think about what you were calling the hyperbolic nature of TikTok videos. And I just did another podcast recently where I talked about how, even though I'm kind of too old for TikTok, I do think it's cool because in a way it does remind me of the earliest days of cinema. The Lumiere brothers basically were making TikTok videos. Their films are 45 seconds long. So whenever I show the earliest films, I always tell my students, these are like early TikTok videos. But I also was thinking about the film Memoria by Api Chatpong, which I'm sure you all know had that, supposedly innovative marketing strategy by Neon, which is we're going to keep it in theaters forever, in the United States at least. And it's going to be this incredibly slow tour where it's only in theaters and only one screen at a time. And that's whether you think that's a gimmick or not, That kind of release strategy and that marketing strategy could only work for a movie of that kind, which is really the opposite of TikTok, because it only works for a film that has a slow rhythm, that's going to be quiet for long stretches, because the whole point is it's an immersive experience when you experience it theatrically. And I don't, I kind of wonder what would happen if Api Shatpong were to make TikTok videos. How would he adjust his style if he were forced to kind of use that format? Could it be done? I don't know. But isn't it kind of remarkable that we're living in a world where, you can experience both things?
Yeah, you said that TV is a cool medium. Would you say, is TikTok hot, or is it cool as well?
Okay, so this is interesting. I think TikTok may actually exist in the space that I refer to as the Steam, which is like, so I've been doing for a long time writing these theories on virtual reality, which I also work in. And the thing with VR is, right, it's an extraordinarily immersive media that throws a bunch at you, that does subdue you. And at the same time, you have all of these choices that you can supposedly make. And in many ways, I think TikTok operates that way, although it's definitely, let's say, cooler, like along the Marshall McLuhan lines, um, because of the sense of the scroll. I think the scroll gives you a false dimension where you feel like you still have a choice in what you're looking at, but really it's actually just a virtual choice that's part of this infinite like tumble, right? And it continues to like algorithmically say warp, and in doing so, it just seems to take on the texture of the phone, right, as like a slippage. It's almost like the way I view it is also, it's almost like the phone itself is just slipping along, and really that scroll exists like as this long thing before and after it.
Yeah.
I also think that you're right though. Like I'm not like say I think the TikTok this TikTok absurdity. I'm a surrealist at heart, I think, and so I'll always quite enjoy seeing things broken. However, I do think say hipsterism and the hipster 2006 to 2012 that Michelle and I were first making art in, that very much affects my being as a filmmaker and what I was say working against. There was a certain absurdity, let's say, to the art that was being made at that time, and the lack of significance or the lack of, say, political motivation behind the work. Even in the tail end of the Bush years, it was almost as though the
Yeah.
writing on the wall was, "Oh, we're going to switch out this war criminal," right? So it's almost like, hey, we were at the end of the Bush years at a time where even Republicans were not a fan of their own president at that point. But especially the Obama years began to usher in this extraordinarily this big loss in the counterculture. I always say it's the counterculture that wasn't countering anything. It was the costume. McLuhan speaks about that as well. He says that that's like what the hippies were doing, was essentially wearing a costume in a form of nostalgia to bring themselves back in a time where the war was so hot, or the world was so hot, or civil rights was so hot that they themselves had to costume themselves. But I wouldn't even bring the hippies down to that level. What happened with the hipsters was nihilism was nice. The cool of nothing, the beginning of the troll, the seeding of the counterculture to the Tea Party. and the Tea Party was hot.
Right.
See, there was like those kind of machinations at hand. If anything, TikTok seeks to cool and yet gives ground for a type of absurdity through its duration or its lack of duration, through its spectacle, as we were discussing, and also through its tiling and its bizarre extension, this sort of extensible structure that it has.
Yeah. Do you, Michael and Michelle, do you guys read McLuhan?
I have not read him. My knowledge of Marshall McLuhan is pretty much limited to his cameo in Annie Hall.
Annie Hall. Yeah. What about Videodrome? There's also.
Oh yeah, that's right.
It, but there's the character.
Yeah, of course. But I'm familiar with the concept of the cool medium, and I'm a big fan of Haskell Wexler's Medium Cool, which of course takes its title from him. Michelle, are you on TikTok at all, or?
No, I've never opened the app. I don't know what the interface looks like.
Yeah.
I've only ever seen it through another app, like when they transfer it over to Instagram or something. So that's, I mean, of course I've heard of it, but wasn't it this week that the Biden administration was going to start doing something about that because of the Chinese, like either they were going to sell it over to the US or they would have to like shut it down or something. And this, like, there was, it's, of course it's owned by the Chinese and that's
and by Walmart,
a national
right? Like
security.
when Trump was gonna like outlaw it, and he's like, okay, like you gotta sell part of it to Walmart in America.
Oh yeah, I think Trump was not a fan. Well, I wouldn't even say like I think he was trying. He was.
He tried to make it illegal
against it, right? Or,
yeah. He tried to like outlaw it. I've never used it really myself. I had it for like 2 seconds and I deleted it because I was like, I don't need this in my life at all. But like I'm the same way. I've seen it through Instagram, but I don't need another app.
Yeah. Well, like one of my, not to interrupt, but one of my biggest like sort of like questions for everyone that does use it and the way that it's been so prevalent in our culture and the way that it feels very casually accepted. What crosses my mind isn't it just common sense, like a national security thing? Is that like, just through every organization that uses, like pretty much every corporation, I mean, there's a bunch of job listings now where, like filmmakers, or I don't even, not pseudo, but like everyone is now on the responsibilities list, like needs to know how to use TikTok or, so it's so openly a thing. And for me, it feels like a no-brainer to not use it because it's like they're basically mining your right, like
but then that also
and it's like a national security issue. I just don't understand why it's like not even a thing.
If that's like, what about all the American ones, which is like all the alternatives, right? That the rest of the world uses. They're all American, but like, they're nationalized? I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of weird because it's like, are we thinking that Twitter is working for America? Or Instagram, or
I mean, that brings up a really good question about the way. I mean, I'm trying to always like return to filmmaking, but to just answer the question, but like it opens up to so many questions about corporations being an entity, like as an individual. Are they held up to the same national laws that every U.S. citizen is? The standards that we all have to obey. And also I think speaking to ideals and ideologies, like I'm not really like a patriotic person or anything, but America at least sort of attempts to have rules and laws and and those are things that will, there's always loopholes around that, but I think TikTok is explicitly owned by the Chinese government, who stand by a set of other like a criteria of like explicitly, and so I think that's really the main difference. So
Yeah.
there isn't any guardrails when it comes to, like, it's not going to be a surprise for them to say, like, well, they snatched this part of your set of, like, I mean, I think there's a whole thing about like professional therapy and like professional like help that you can get through TikTok, and
That's wild.
people are taking this seriously, and medical professionals, like TikTok personalities offering, yeah, so that's another thing this week, right? So TikTok is very, yeah, I'm kind of curious to see where that's landing with the Biden administration trying to shut it down or to sell it.
Do you remember LiveJournal? Do you guys remember LiveJournal?
Yes,
Like, so that was an American product, I think. But
I
then that
think mine
was,
is still up.
yeah, it probably is. But it was bought like in 2003 or something by a Russian oligarch. And I remember people were really kind of stressed out about that because they're like, "Uh-oh, what's going to happen to all my journal stuff?"
That was like my generation. I'm old. Like Tumblr.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then
mine too.
Tumblr,
Yeah.
yeah, and to circle back on the conversation, if you follow the online culture war of like Tumblr, 4chan, that gives us the Tea Party and like all of that, and now we're
Mhm.
here. And the reversal of, liberal and conservative, I mean, Democratic and Republican, this kind of reversal. So goes back to LiveJournal.
Yeah, like during like Russiagate and all that, I was kind of thinking about how it'd be kind of funny if they were using the live journals to like train the Russian troll bots, you know, and then they're using that to take us down, That would've been- like feeding all that old info in there.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so LiveJournal was to Tumblr what Friendster was to Facebook. Is that? I never had LiveJournal.
I never had
Yeah,
Friendster.
I had Friendster. I don't know. I was in the Bay Area.
It was Facebook before Facebook.
Yeah, all you could do is
Did
be
it?
friends.
Before, yeah. So there wasn't like a whole lot of money. I think there wasn't a whole lot of advertising.
And you
The
couldn't
Yeah,
way
do
that
anything.
there was MySpace in between this. So was
Yeah,
Friendster around the same time, or?
before MySpace, it was like the first one.
Friendster predated MySpace. Yeah.
And all you could do was like say that you knew people. It would have been a good way to just like infiltrate or spy. Like that's all it really was. It was like I'm friends with these people.
Well, I would like to point something out, though, just to bring it back to my original topic. Even though I said I am too old for Relative, I did create, or too old for TikTok. I did create a uh, Relative TikTok page for my film because I was advised to
Yeah.
by my executive producers as an effective form of advertising the movie. Because basically, my executive producers. I'm talking about New City Magazine here in Chicago. They were basically told, by someone in the know, someone in Silicon Valley, oh, um, TikTok is the best social space for this film. So what I did, what I was partially responsible for doing, was getting two of the young actors in my film to create TikTok videos in character, as if they're having a long distance relationship. And so they're basically sending each other video messages across TikTok in character. And I had a lot of fun because our young actress, Elizabeth Stam, is in Chicago. And then our young actor, who is her love interest, was living in New Mexico. So it kind of worked out for her to send him a video message on TikTok and then for him to respond. And I had fun. I mean, I did think it was a fun, creative way to advertise the film because we were basically making little short films that were kind of an extension of the universe of the movie. The only reason why we stopped doing it, we did it about 12 times, and the numbers, started to go up and up and up as time went by. And I was helping Liz do the videos here in Chicago. We actually got, by the way, if you guys have seen Twin Peaks, my favorite series of all time, Wendy Roby from that show is in my film. And we got her to do her first TikTok, which is amazing because, we were like, hey, Wendy Roby, do you want to do a TikTok? She said, sure. So there's like a little TikTok video of her. She's also in character talking to this young actress outside of a Starbucks in Lincoln Square. But the only reason why we stopped is because the young actor playing the boyfriend, he's not a social media guy. So he would kind of put way too much thought into it. He would like script out his videos, and he was so slow about it that, I couldn't egg him on any further than what I was doing, and it kind of died. But so I don't want to be too cynical about dismissing it out of hand, because in my brief foray into that world, I did kind of see the creative possibilities, and I did have a little bit of fun with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a divergence here between the creative possibilities of the form, let's say, of the TikTok and the political considerations of the machinations of that platform. And essentially, right, like TikTok is a renewed, maybe existed before, but it is like the substitute to Vine was, right? When Vine tanked as a result, let's say, of Twitter's own potential malfeasance, and then we get into like this social media tumble. But I guess where I'm taking it as well is back to Michelle's point about like, why is it that, say, a filmmaker must take this interdisciplinary role or multidisciplinary role. On one hand, I would say is as a multidisciplinary artist, the construction of a film is itself multidisciplinary, especially if one has to do so independently. So when you take it from that like framework, let's say it's the framework of the artist or the filmmaker that is literally doing everything, the camera work, the art direction, and of course the experimental filmmaker model is one that we see that in. Of course, we have the video artists. I'd say, as you were talking about Michelle Godard, Goodbye to Language. Someone like Cheryl Dunny, for instance, who's involved in every aspect of the crafting and then also stars within the work itself in a performative and identity way. Matthew Barney, of course, and Pip Lottie-Riss, hand in hand there. Through the construction of parts of the feature film, which serve as like the basis for their exhibitions, which have physical objects or have immersive experiences and installation as actually the say the end exhibition format of their work. I always bring up Aldo Tambolini, but Aldo's work was essentially, hey, what's the new media? I'm going to express this concept within every single step of the media as it's progressing towards the form that I think that it wants to take ultimately, which itself is nihilistic, which is this full virtual reality, this full immersive mode. And what does that mean to political blackness as well as cosmic blackness? What we have is on that's one end of it, right? That's one avenue. It's the filmmaker thinking through multiple disciplines as a necessity, and then there's also the filmmaker or artist in general having to work within multiple disciplines as a political objective in order to be able to squirrel their way into any sort of exhibition format that will show part of their work as a means of grabbing audience, to bring audience in to see the thing that they're working so hard to put out there, that they might not have the marketing resources or the other resources in order to get their work shown or placed within theater, or placed in front of those gatekeepers, or given, actually, forget placed in front of. Most people don't get placed in front of a gatekeeper. It's the gatekeeper passes them on along because another person has said, okay, vouch for this, or there's some sort of political method or political leaning that enables certain artists to have placement as a exemplified form of a system that's working, when in fact the system is destroyed from the interior. So there are two different avenues at hand, and I think that this, what does an artist do with social media, is at the very core of it. I hate it, I loathe it, and yet at the same time, I am on Instagram nonstop as part of my job, as part of my artwork, as part of, to the point where it literally removes a level of the real, the physical, from being, it primes people for addiction. It gives a an underlying fear of not just missing out, but of not being part of a social fabric. I always felt that when I was younger too, like not being able to tune into television. And this kind of brings me back over to you, Will, too. I always felt that live television programming, despite the fact that it wouldn't be live, but I always felt like those points when I could commune with a supposed live other
Yeah.
was like a warming and comforting feeling.
Well,
I always
because you're
wanted there.
connecting, you're
Yeah,
connecting to the audience,
that's
right?
it.
To like the global audience that's watching psychically. You're, yeah.
Well, that's it. This is it. This psychic, right? Yeah. The psychical, but in reality, we're even us like having this conversation. We're so separated, and yet so on top of each other's time space, that I begin to think of these sort of illusory points in our existence. Even how time is passing on this conversation is not being anything that I can truly perceive, but it's something that I've been primed to perceive. The idea of it being actually absurd and shaping so much of the 20th and the 21st century now, that we cannot even fathom a consciousness that existed before this televised broadcast.
Well, Michael, I hate social media as much as you do. And I also find it to be absolutely necessary as an artist, and I think it's funny, if I could pay someone to do it for me, I would, and then I would just tune out. But I'm not successful enough to do that, So it's like I'm incredibly shrewd about how I use it. I do, like you, I'm on Instagram all the time. I also have Facebook and Twitter, and I feel like I reach a different audience through each of those platforms. Facebook is kind of like where the older folks are, right? That's where my parents are, and people of that. And I think there's a class difference as well, But it's interesting to think about those two avenues, because you can look at these websites, social media and otherwise, as kind of exploiting us as artists by mining our data, but it's kind of a reciprocal exploitation, right? Because we're using them as well. And when I was telling you what I did on TikTok, I felt it was kind of subversive, right? I felt like I was using them by creating these fake video letters between fictional characters that, people who weren't aware of my movie might have thought was a real correspondence. I think there's something genuinely subversive about that. So, so it's an interesting, these are strange days we're living, right?
Yeah, I mean, the way I've always tried to do it is just like use as much stuff that's free as possible for whatever means you're trying to use it for. And yeah, so like whatever it is, Yeah.
Yeah, especially because we are all, we're all multi hyphenates, like Michelle says. I mean, I'm a teacher. That's my primary means of income, right? I teach full time year round because I'm an adjunct at multiple colleges. So when I make films, I do it in my spare time, and yet I've been able to kind of amass a body of work, um, and being able to use social media to market that is that's kind of indistinguishable in a way from what I feel like I'm doing as an artist, because in the year 2023, if you're an artist, you kind of have to be a hustler as well, and that's why I'm on this. That's part of the reason why I'm on this podcast right now. The hustle never ends, you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think Will, when you said try to get your hands on anything that's free, that just kind of led me to think of like I don't think I, you know, strategically think about it as much as I just follow an instinct and it's unfolded this way, but there's something to creating I mean, this might be back to like before TikTok days and like the way we see Hollywood celebrities and they're a bit like holier than thou or like unreachable and like just the Oscar celebrities or something. And now it's like there's a whole conversation about what was it there like there was a New York magazine on like nepo babies and all of that. But oh, so on that train of thought, I was thinking, there's something to the seduction of keep it like I hate to use this word, but like curating, or maybe not. Let's not use that word, but like just being a little bit more selective about the way you're putting your work or yourself out there. Um, so I don't know. I'm just putting a different side. There's on one hand, it's like Pokemon catch them all. Just put yourself out there and get as many eyes or whatever. Or it's get the right to eyes to see your
Yeah.
work or something. But
Do
mostly that I'm interested in like creating that, not for myself. I'm just interested in the idea of like the seduction or the power of seduction, um, whether it's art or relationship dynamics or anything like that, that just, is really powerful. So, in that sense, I don't know if it's more kind of liberating now that we can create and strategy. Like you hear that word strategy all the time, or like content creators, or like the influencers, or whatever. I mean, it's a lot of jumble, um, but of course, every sort of strength has its like other like floodgates of like opportunities and that's another way of thinking about yeah. But back onto the nepo baby sort of article where um we can talk all day long about how it's unfair, but it is also like they're not being seen the way that their parents are being seen like we do. There's a level of um not integrity, but like you're like, oh, there's Brad Pitt, like, whatever. But now it's like, well, who's like, I don't know, I'm not really up to date, but we don't see um the gravity of like fame is very different now. So I don't know if that like segues into self distribution, but that's my little bit about that.
actually no, I probably shouldn't even say what I was gonna say. You can go.
Now you really have to say it. Come on
Yeah.
now.
Like when so I work in animation, right? And I've done so since 2007. Uh, and like when you're casting a movie, you're looking at all these different people, and like somewhere along the line, they started to try to put like YouTube people in. It was like they had to kind of re-strategize. They're like, okay, we need YouTube people. We need like this new media stuff, and they're trying to put some of those people into, you know, into the old machine. And then like maybe 2 years after that, I started seeing names on there, and they were like the kids of celebrities, you know. And it was like, okay, this is interesting. It was like that was a new thing. Instead of celebrities, you know, then it was like these unknown people, and then it was like these fake unknown people, which I think is like the nepo baby thing, you know. I don't know. I didn't really think about that till just now, but
Yeah, I mean, the question of Nepo baby is a really interesting one to chart, like the shifting, like that's one way if that's positive space. Like it's just a way of like capturing our values surrounding it. I mean, because we're tracing a line of like, well, of course this person can act because they grew up watching their parents or something. And so there's all sorts of questions about whether their talent holds up in like the way we view um yeah, fame and all of that.
which
So
which
yeah,
like
that's
goes
my
back to like the beginning of show business, right? Like that's like a
true,
very
yeah.
old thing, kind of. Uh, yeah.
It goes back to royalty too.
Well,
The
yeah,
i-
yeah,
you know, like just this idea of the extension of generational wealth and things of that nature. I find it really interesting though that there's also like that there's the nepotism or the nepo babies. Like this is something like we were talking about Lon Chaney actually in a previous episode. Shout out to Christina from Chestnut. And Christina Santa Cruz was mentioning Lon Chaney and Lon Chaney Jr. And of course the Barrymores and whatnot, and what were referred to as Hollywood royalty, right? At a certain point, the Houston's is a great example as well, right? And yet there's also this having been in England and seen kind of like the old money, new money sort of deal. There's also all of these riches, and there's all this nepotism that occurs without the fame, like, or without the like the outward, and they actually don't really necessarily want that spotlight. And in fact, that they operate better, or they operate with more power and more wealth when they're able to sort of hide like elements of that. Like it's been really interesting. I mean, I don't know if there's really a direct tie to make, but thinking about the supposed um, venture capitalist tanking of banks, for instance, and how the media has essentially been trying to come up with many different faults to place. Like first, it's the cryptocurrencies that did it. Then it's Peter Thiel that did it. Well, probably Peter Thiel's part of the problem, but rather there's also like this lurking, the thing that's undergirding the whole breaking that will occur at this point, the depression, the avalanche that we see in slow motion from a distance, which is that it's built on nothing. Like the whole thing is built on nothing, and of course the media is going to propagate that which is more nothing in order to make sure that their nothing continues to have a significance despite the fact that it's nothing. So whether it be a dynasty of celebrity children, or whether it be the monetary system itself, they make work about nothing so that there's a meta nothing, so that there's like an endless say Wikipedia tumble through things that don't have significance in order to be able to bury the things that do, which brings us to the algorithm, right? So the algorithm does the same, and the algorithm really only wants to propagate that which might have the possibility of building more capital for the platform itself. Otherwise, that particular content would not, say, blow up, or that content wouldn't get more views. And when something goes viral, there's so many different levels of its virality, right? We might, for instance, in this conversation, settle for a virality, let's say, or like a contagion that is thousands of likes. But the things that get the millions, the things that really take off, are almost always the things that are themselves full of a type of a purified nothing that won't have an effect ever in a transgressive way or a subversive way. As Michael, you're saying, those social media platforms, they do offer say subversive operations. They offer, for instance, the ability to do something like the Situationists, and I would argue that the Situationists did, in fact, or even hip hop. I would say, something that I often argue with others about is that form of militant politics, of meanings distilled within rhythmic form, within samples, within the production style itself, within rhyme schemes, within emceeing, that is at the heart of hip hop, and the crypto as being the hip hop mode, right? Not the cryptocurrency, but the cryptic, and how that, say, infiltrated major mainstream channels and continues to do so, though potentially, let's say, hampered by many different other factors that have everything to do with currency and nothing to do with the everything and the infinitude that could be cradled within that particular form of art. So I think that's what we get at with the avant-garde. It was, what is the avant-garde doing, but actually potentially being something radical. Not avant-garde in the sense of like, oh, the French avant-garde or like whatnot, but avant-garde in the front line, the use of media as a weaponry. And I think that's what we're also discussing here, is like, how is one self-distributing? How are you getting your troops on the line? How is Will, for instance, infiltrating a normally very cool media in the sense of not only just the selection, but also in the sense of who gets to be put onto television as being a very almost venerated form, this broadcast, that's not given the, say, avenues of even the online space. But then who is able to actually arise above all of the others in order to have their voice or significance heard? So in many ways, we are talking about strategy, as you said,
I have
Michelle.
I have a quick question while you're
Mhm.
talking. Because I'm not currently deep in the film distribution and programming world. Um, do you, and I'll hear from, I guess, everyone. Are they privileging the who, or is it the content, like the story you're telling? Like, is it because I find that there's an urgency in, telling certain stories. So is it really like, I don't want to get into, um, identities and all of that, but like, is it the who, or is it just your story is just not particular in particularly urgent enough at this time to be told, or what is the criteria now? And I'm just talking about, um, you know, I guess the gatekeeping institutions. We can name names or not, but I don't know. Like, I'm so out of it that I think having this conversation, speaking in particulars, would help. But that I am very curious. Is it, yeah? How is this process being? Yeah. What what's the process like, guys?
I'm going to say this before I let everybody else answer. I do have an answer for this too. I'm going to let this be the final word. So this is an awesome question. Please take it away, anybody.
So also one more thing is that I don't know your work, Michael, but Mercury in Retrograde is an awesome title. And it just like it already implies so much that I have questions for a returning podcast episode for next time. But like that's another conversation because I'm very interested in you taking whether you're conscious of it or not, taking a very spiritual or at least the culture of it. I feel like that's a word that everybody uses now, whether or not they give into astrology. It's become such a meme that I'm just curious about that as well. But
Well, thank you. I hope you get to see it. Mercury in when I wrote Mercury in retrograde in 2015, I felt like the phrase wasn't that well known. And then when I released the film in 2017, it seemed like it had kind of achieved a something in the cultural consciousness, which was very bizarre. But anyway, it's a movie about three couples from Chicago who go on vacation to a lakeside cabin in Michigan while Mercury is in retrograde. And it's very much about communication, and miscommunication during that weekend between all six characters. So you can watch it for, it's actually, it's streaming on Amazon Prime. It's also on Freevee. Do you know that streaming platform?
I don't, but I have Amazon Prime. So
okay, you can watch it on Prime. Freevee is like the Internet Movie Database streaming service, and you can watch it with commercials. But yeah, please watch it and let me know what you think. Some people think it's my best film. But anyway, I wanted to say, Michael, I really liked hearing you talk about the thousands versus the millions. And you had this kind of honor role of artists, the situationists, the avant-garde, the hip hop artists you're talking about. I would like to add Jean-Luc Godard to that group, since Michelle brought him up at the beginning with Goodbye to Language, which I think is one of the great films of the past decade. And I think he's a really interesting artist to talk about in this context, because it seems to me like he was almost embarrassed by the success that he achieved with his earliest work. And he kind of deliberately marginalized himself later on. And so I think that's interesting, because it's almost like, he knew that whatever he made was going to play at the Cannes Film Festival, right? Which is huge. And that's the other thing about the film festival circuit that we didn't really talk about, is that the film festival circuit for a lot of people is a sort of de facto form of theatrical distribution, because for a lot of filmmakers, especially people who make shorts, that's the only time their film's ever going to be projected. But what's interesting to me about Godard, that I think is really inspiring, is that especially in his recent work, he knew he was making these weird essay films that were only going to play to a very specialized audience. And yet, like with Goodbye to Language, that's a 3D film. It's the greatest 3D film. And it's kind of like he was forcing, and it's like, how many art house theaters had 3D projectors in the year 2013, right? The Gene Siskel Film Center in Chicago had to install one just to show the movie. So
do you know what sort of technology it was? Was it like, did it use the Z screen?
I don't know what Z screen is, but
well,
he
okay.
he and his cinematographer created their own 3D camera rig, where they basically, I think, God, I'm not sure what kind of cameras they use, but it
was two DSLRs on a wooden plank.
Yeah. On a wooden plank, right, that were positioned 2.5 inches apart, right?
And the shot where like it follows one person and the other person walks away, like that was amazing.
Yes, the camera on the right panned right while the other one stayed straight ahead, so the image kind of split apart into two 2D images overlapping, and then it goes back. When I saw that in Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, the audience broke out into applause during that shot because they were seeing something they had never seen before. I mean, it was insane. And I've never experienced that in a movie where people clapped in the middle of a film. Although, you know, it was a college audience, a lot of filmmakers there, everyone was there to worship. And then he did the same thing with the Image Book, his last feature, which he did it with sound. Because I don't know if you guys know this, the audio, by the way, I had no clue I was going to be talking about Godard, but you all inspired me. The soundtrack was in 7.1 surround sound. The only options that he made that available to be heard in theatrically, it was either 7.1 or 2.0. Nothing in between. He was like, you know, there's no 5.1, which is what every theater is equipped to show. So either you install 7.1 channels of sound, and he used them all because the sound is ping-ponging around, you know, every channel, or you have to do the primitive version where you're not getting surround at all. And guess what? I mean, you know, I live in Chicago. The Gene Siskel Film Center installed 7.1 just for that screening. So I think he's the epitome to me of a radical artist who is, you know, making films that appear to be playing for the tiniest audience, and yet he's going to end up influencing everything. You know, all of his innovations, you know, the shot that Will is talking about with the 3D, you know, that I don't know what the budget of Goodbye to Language was, probably in the six figures. But he did something with 3D that nobody in Hollywood has ever done with 3D, with all of their millions of dollars, you know, with all those multi-million-dollar budgets. But someday someone will do that. You know, someone's going to imitate that. It's going to be some Tom Cruise movie on Mars. They'll figure out a way to integrate it into the narrative, and then everyone's going to be like, "No, Godard did that in 2013."
So yeah, I was working on animated movies when they switched to 3D. Do you know Lenny Lipton? Lenny Lipton's an interesting guy. He wrote the lyrics to Puff the Magic Dragon, right? At Peter, Paul, and Mary's dorm when he was in college, and then he left, and he didn't think anything of it. And then they wrote the song. They put him down as the author of the lyrics, right? So he got the songwriting credit, and he got money, and then he used that to have like a independent filmmaking career based. I think he was maybe a professor or something. He wrote a book called Underground Cinema, but then he got really into 3D movies, and he created Real D. And so to do that, you used like a Z screen. He called it a Z screen. Prior to this, I think you needed a modified projectors, or like two projectors or something to do it, right? And it was like a lot of equipment. But with the Z screen, you could use your old digital projector, and it would just flicker back and forth. Like the screen would flicker, right? And that would do it. And then it would interact with the glasses you were wearing. But you needed a silver screen to project onto. So there was the cost of getting a silver screen. Anyways, you know.
That's new. That is brand new info to me, but that's amazing, actually. Okay. To speak to Michelle's question. Oh, do you have a, yeah.
Oh, no. I said we got to get back to that question. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'll say this. And this is, again, I always say this. I didn't say it today during this podcast. I am both a marketing manager for Chicago Filmmakers, but in no way are my opinions the opinions of Chicago filmmakers, or sometimes they are. I would say this. The curatorial and programming communities are made up of a lot of academics often. They're made up of people who wants to pretend that they don't care about popularity, but they still do. And at the heart, everybody's still in high school and everybody wants to be seen. Even if they're anti-capitalist, they use this anti-capitalist gesture as a form of capital, and they don't even recognize that popularity is a form of capital. And so on one end, yes, it's about who's who. It's about who can I get to talk to if I put them in there. I think that definitely does motivate some folks. But I also think, honestly, there's like an unconscious, like a lot of gatekeepers are the unconscious gatekeepers. The conscious ones are scary, but the unconscious ones are scary in the sense that they don't even recognize that they're gatekeeping. And oftentimes it's motivated out of this idea that, oh, well, if I represent the institutions that have, say, taken me on, or if I represent the friends of friends of friends, then that's okay. Then at the very least, as long as I'm hitting a certain, say, new demographic requirement, that I have done the necessary work, right? And I can then rest on my laurels. I think that there's so much supposed curating that's not curating. They're not even looking at the work. I think there's a lot of films. Well, I mean, mathematically speaking, how can Sundance watch all of its movies? It's impossible. How can any of these film festivals watch all their movies? They get people who work either at the studios, the corporations that back the projects, which I've seen directly, to talk to the programmers, or they're looking out for names that they know. And in the worst case scenario, I think that they're just sifting through to see who they may or may not know, or who may or may not meet a certain quota, based upon their own impression, even of the name itself, which is of a particular type of low bar, and a form of racism and a form of classism that is truly disgusting, actually. Now, I think that the other thing is that there is an unsaid role that institutions play as a brand, and that people within institutions play as a representative of said brand, where they work in a form of psychological affect that pulls the arm of its cohorts to continue to perpetuate their power hold within those frameworks, whether or not it's just friends or if it's, say, a school. But I find that it's far more insidious than a conscious decision. It's like a conspiracy where many of the actors are just useful, not to use the term, but to say that they are usefully ignorant. Oh,
Well,
and
I mean,
Michelle, yes, you get the last word.
oh gosh, the last word. This has to go on for another couple episodes. We have to reconvene to talk about the state of, but
Real quick. When you say the last word, you have to then say bye. Okay, that's how you end the
bye,
episode.
like
Okay,
that.
but yeah, but don't, not now, because I'm not going to get confused and I'm going to hit end event and then this is going to be over, right? But when you're done with the last word, you have to
Okay,
say bye. Okay.
I'll try.
All right.
But my last word is that I'm cautioning against trying to phrase all of this in a way that makes it seem as though the world hasn't always been. All of this is just coming down to power. And when we talk about everything's a high school metaphor, American high school, like everyone, everyone has a character afterwards. Like, are you the whatever? Are you the band member? Or this or that? Even when we're talking about Nepo babies, when we're talking about is this country a merit-based one I mean, it comes down to these questions, and like, I'm not trying to say that there's a natural course of things. I'm not like, but it does it comes down to power, and it's sort of a game of who can get that. If that means talking to someone, it means talking to someone. And if you're buried in the dark room and you're not talking to someone, you're not playing the game. I'm not saying I like the game, but the world is a game, it seems like, politically, everything. And it just, I think it's more useful to maybe like think of, I'm just trying to find out ways of making things a bit more useful, because it's it's a little like people who do have the power and the gatekeepers, like the question that jumps out at me is like, why are we banging on doors? Like, what, not we, but like, why is that the question, or why is that the prerogative? And I will end it at that. So bye.